So for our last meeting of 2020, we are super pleased to have a very special speaker present tonight on the topic of 3 billion birds lost, the disappearance of North American birds and what we can do about it. Ken Rosenberg is an applied conservation scientist at Cornell Lab of Ornithology with a joint partnership appointment at American Bird Conservancy. Ken has been at Cornell for 27 years and after receiving a PhD in zoology from Louisiana State University, studying foraging specialization in Amazonian birds, an MS from Arizona State University, and a BS from Cornell. Ken's current research focuses on the conservation status and health of bird populations and filling crucial knowledge gaps that impede full annual cycle conservation migratory birds, especially the stopover behavior of our long-distant migrants in Central and South America. Ken has been a longtime leader in Partners in Flight and is on the U.S. Committee of North American Bird Conservation Initiative, where he leads NABCI's production of U.S. and North American State of the Birds reports. He is also a fellow at Cornell's Atkinson Center for Sustainable Future. Ken is a lifelong birder and is dedicated to promoting amateur contributions to ornithology and conservation through eBird and other citizen science programs. Please give a very warm welcome to Ken Rosenberg.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Jeannie, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it's sort of strange times to do all of this on Zoom. I wish I was there in person to meet everybody. I am going to share my screen and hope that this all works as well as it did in the practice.
Perfect.
Is that working?
Yes.
You see just the slide?
Yes.
The hummingbird?
Yes.
All right.
All right.
You, boy, we practiced this so many times.
I know.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so, okay, so we're all here because we appreciate the wonder of birds. And, you know, besides bringing us joy, birds are also sensitive indicators of the health of our overall environment. For all wildlife and humans. So what does it mean to lose more than 1/4 of the continent's birds in a single lifetime? Well, declines of migratory birds are not a new thing. We could go back to 50 years ago when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, which helped to give birth to the modern environmental movement, really, and resulted in the banning of harmful pesticides such as DDT. And Carson was a bird watcher, and some of the key evidence that she gathered for her book were the declines in birds, and they even gave her the title. So at that time, a friend of Rachel Carson's was Chandler Robbins, who worked for the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And in response to Silent Spring, Chan had the vision to create the North American Breeding Bird Survey in 1966 as a means for tracking changes in bird populations across the continent. And this BBS remains our primary source of data on bird populations. And Robbins himself published the first big analysis in 1989 that sounded the alarm for the declines of this big group of birds we call neotropical migrants, which are sort of shown there in that red map, which means decline. So more recently, we've put out things like the State of the Birds reports that have reported population trends and used these trends as indicators of overall environmental health. And so the indicator lines that you can see in reports like this, they represent the average population trends across whole groups of species. So we've seen declines in grassland birds, certain forest birds, and usually increases in wetland birds. So what these indicators don't tell us is the number of birds lost or gained. So whether the total abundance of birds has changed. So this was the basic question that we started out with when we began this study in 2017. If we take into account both increasing and declining species, did we see a net change in the bird population abundance? Are there fewer birds today than there were at the start of the breeding bird survey in 1970, or are we seeing this shift towards increasing habitat generalists, urban adapted, and invasive species, that sort of thing? So to answer this question, we needed to compile the most reliable estimates of both population trend and population size for as many species as possible. And this in itself was a huge job. So we relied on long-term monitoring data sets from both citizen science, such as the Breeding Bird Survey, which was our main source, but also the Christmas bird count for birds that really you could only see and count in the wintertime, and also surveys by professional biologists, such as aerial waterfowl surveys. And we're very lucky to have this 50-year data set. It doesn't really exist for any other group of organisms. And it represents an incredible collaboration between scientists and birders. So this is sort of an overview of our methods, which I don't need to go into too much detail. Basically, we compiled the best data available for each species, synthesizing these data sets and getting them into just the right format for a big analysis was a huge job. It took really the first year of the project just to get the data together. But it resulted in having both trend and population size estimates for 529 species. And that's about 3/4 of the breeding species in North America, but it really represents almost 99% of the abundance, because most of the birds we don't have data for tend to be very rare or peripheral species. So these data were then combined into a single large statistical model that basically took into account the variability that you see from year to year in all these bird surveys, and also took into account the breeding habitat and the winter region that these birds go to. So just as an example, in those graphs there, the graph on the upper left are a group of 7 species that breed in the boreal forest and migrate all the way to South America. And then that's the trend for that group. And then we combine the trends for each of those groups into a single result. But because even the best survey data still rely on human observers, we wanted a completely independent measure of bird abundance. So we turned to weather radar, which I believe you all had a recent presentation on. And as you know, you can see and measure the magnitude of migration in the sky over the US using this radar. So in this animated map, as you can see the weather front moving off there, off to the East Coast, those blue-green blooms that appear behind the weather front are migrating birds. And so we've known this, and there are 143 of these NEXRAD radar stations across the US. And by combining all this data together, which was another huge data set that required supercomputers, my co-author, Adrian Doctor, who's at Cornell Lab, and he leads the aeroecology research team there, and he was able to get this cumulative measure of the passage of bird migration over the entire spring migration period, and that's what's shown here. And it's a measure of the biomass of birds moving over the country. And we can then go back through time to see if that total biomass of migration had changed over time. Okay, so the results, as most of you know, when we ran the numbers, a pretty staggering and sobering result. Across 529 species, we see a net population loss of 2.9 billion birds since 1970. And this represents a 29% reduction in the total breeding bird abundance, across the avifauna. And more than 300 individual species showed a loss in population. So we broke this down for groups of species in several different ways, such as across major breeding habitats or biomes, which is shown in this slide and the map there in the inset in the upper right. So on this slide, the absolute change in abundance for each biome is graphed on the left panel, and then the relative change in abundance is shown with the bar graphs in the center. And when we look across all these different biomes, we see a net loss in nearly every habitat, including habitat generalists. The largest loss, both in terms of absolute and relative loss, was in grassland birds, and those are the gold colored lines and bars. There was a loss of 700 million individual birds, more than half of all grassland birds since 1970. We also estimated that the boreal forest, which is shown in dark green, has lost 500 million birds in this time period. The only biome to show a moderate increase was wetland birds, and that's the blue bar at the top there. And as you can see, these don't even come close to compensating for the losses. And that's because wetland bird populations are much smaller than most terrestrial bird populations. So all wetland birds combined, for example, don't even add up to a single sparrow or warbler or bird like the American robin. If we break the results down more finely by taxonomic bird families, we see that there are winners and losers. So in this figure, they're what we call wheel graphs, represent the absolute change in abundance within each family. So the red wheel are for families that show a net loss in abundance, and the blue wheel for families that show a net gain. And the size of the wheels are proportional. So there's been a total loss of 3.2 billion birds and a total gain of only 250 million birds in this analysis. And a majority of the loss has occurred in several large bird families, such as sparrows, warblers, and blackbirds, although 38 families showed a net loss, net population loss, and 10 families have lost more than 50 million individual birds. On the gain side, there were 29 bird families that showed a net gain. And among the biggest winners were vireos, waterfowl, and raptors. So I have to say the vireo results are probably some of the strangest that we've got. In every bird habitat where you have a whole bunch of declining warblers or other birds, the vireo that's found there is usually on the increase. So if anybody has any ideas of why red-eyed vireos are increasing, I would like to hear that. So it's not every bird that's declining. But perhaps the most surprising result is that half of the total net loss was made up of 10 very common and widespread species. So birds like horned lark, dark-eyed junco, savanna sparrow, red-winged blackbird. These are examples of familiar birds that have lost hundreds of millions of individuals. So bird population declines and loss are not just restricted to rare and threatened species, but they're pervasive among common and familiar species. So the results of the radar analysis were equally disturbing. We're able to go back just 11 years in this analysis to look at change in total migration. And the red circles indicate individual radar stations that saw a significant decline in spring migration over the past decade. And they're mostly in the east and central US, and west of that gray shaded area, the trends were either too weak or too variable to show a statistically significant pattern. So if we combine that trend surface with the cumulative biomass passage that I showed a minute ago, we get a surface of the loss of biomass in spring migration over the US. And so the largest loss in migration were in the eastern half of the US, in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, whereas there was no significant change, as I said, in migration over the western US. And we found overall in spring that the spring migration biomass declined by 14% since 2007, or about 1.5% per year, which is about the same rate of decline, that the magnitude decline that we saw from the survey data. So this gave us a lot of confidence from these two very independent data sources that this result was real. So why does it matter so much, especially that we're losing these common birds? Well, for those of us who love birds in nature, this is a tragedy. It's sad to see the loss of common familiar birds. But keeping common birds common makes conservation sense also for several reasons. First, we know that species decline before they become endangered or go extinct, right? So we have the lesson of the passenger pigeon, which was the most abundant bird to ever live in North America. So think about it, we've lost a passenger pigeon's worth of birds in less than our lifetime. And the decline of the passenger pigeon probably looked a lot like the declines we're seeing in many other common species right now. So if we had had monitoring in place and maybe have been able to detect that 30% decline in passenger pigeons, then maybe society would have been able to act and prevent this extinction. So the loss of abundance in common and widespread species also signals the loss of ecosystem integrity, the diminishing of the spectacle of bird migration, and they parallel declines in birds, insects, and other taxa that we're seeing globally. So what are the primary causes of these declines? Well, our study didn't really specifically address the causes, and these are not as easy to pin down as you would think for individual species. But we know from lots of other evidence that habitat loss and degradation are the primary drivers of bird declines by far. And a common theme in the largest declines that we saw, so grassland birds, but also other common open country birds, such as red-winged blackbirds, is that these are birds associated with agricultural landscapes. So what we're seeing with the intensification of agriculture is that where not too long ago there were fallow fields or grassy margins or hedgerows, now it's just horizon to horizon cornfields or other crops. And also with more intensive use of more and more toxic pesticides. So this combined with urban sprawl, loss of tropical forests where a lot of our birds migrate to in the winter, we're seeing every bit of nature just squeezed out to the point where our landscapes cannot support basic bird populations. And on top of this are the many human-caused factors that we all know kill huge numbers of birds, such as cats, glass windows, and various structures. And these might not be the primary drivers of the declines, but they make it more difficult for birds to survive in the remaining habitats that we do have. And these are all things that we could do something about. We have proven solutions for minimizing this human-caused mortality. And because the declines are so pervasive across so many different habitats and groups of bird species, we know that these birds are facing multiple interacting threats. And some of these are difficult for us to measure, such as the effects of pesticides or energy development, as we were just hearing about before the presentation, light pollution from cities, increasing frequency of extreme weather, all of which are probably being exacerbated by climate change. So that's a lot of doom and gloom. And we're frequently asked whether there's any reasons for hope, whether our analysis had any positive glimmers in it. And the answer is yes. We know that bird populations also can be very resilient, and we have many examples of where conservation has been successful. And one of them is the remarkable recovery of the bald eagle and other birds of prey after we removed what we knew was causing the decline, which were the DDT and other pesticides, and reduced persecution of raptors. These birds responded very positively, and we're still seeing almost an exponential increase in the populations of bald eagle. But perhaps the most hopeful example is the increase in waterfowl populations, more than a 50% increase since 1970. And this is not an accident, right? I mean, it was the waterfowl hunters who noticed population declines, and they did something about it. They raised their voices, put money where their mouths are, and the result were policies and a dedicated funding stream, billions of dollars really, that has gone into protecting and restoring millions of acres of wetlands, and the duck populations rebounded, all to provide a sustainable recreational hunting resource. So the big question for us moving forward is how can we replicate these successes for other groups of birds? So another reason for hope, I think, is this really phenomenal response that we've had to the publication of our paper. We were on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. Hundreds of articles appeared in almost every major news outlet. There were more than 1,700 media outlets that covered this story of 3 billion birds lost, and with a reach of over 3 billion people. So it's had very broad appeal across the political spectrum. We were headlines on Fox News and Breitbart News even. And for the most part, the coverage of this story was very accurate and actually quite positive. Because as I did all these media interviews after the publication of the paper, every reporter asked the same question: what can people do to help birds? So in response to this publication, a coalition of bird conservation organizations that included the co-authors from the paper, as well as the Audubon Society and other groups, launched a bird crisis campaign to sound the alarm and promote action. And they created this shared website called 3billionbirds.org. And on the 3 Billion Birds site is where people can go to get more details. Can you hear a lot of background noise on my end? Sorry to interrupt. Can somebody tell me if there's a lot of background noise?
A little bit, yes.
Okay. Hold on one second. Here. All right, well, thanks. Sorry about that. It's just the perils of doing this from your home office. So yeah, so at this 3 Billion Birds website, you can go and find information on the findings. It's actually a place where you can download a copy of the science paper for anybody who wants to read it. But in addition, this site points people to solutions, mostly in the form of these, what we call the 7 simple actions. So these are things like making windows safe from bird collisions, or keeping cats indoors, using native plants in your yard to create habitat, or drinking bird-friendly coffee. And all of these actions are things that individuals can do that can make a difference for birds. And each of these are actions that people can also take to a larger scale, being active in their communities, or ultimately creating change at the policy and societal level. So I just want to highlight one of these, the last of the 7 simple actions that people can take, which is to contribute data. So our study relied heavily on citizen science monitoring programs, such as the BBS, Christmas Bird Count, with much of the data collected by volunteer birders. So eBird is a relatively new program that's growing exponentially. And while we couldn't use eBird data to study the trends of species going back 50 years because it's too new, eBird's going to be more and more important.
No, I did not.
Everything okay? In the future, for tracking bird populations at really fine scales and throughout the year. And it's going to allow us to evaluate the success of future conservation actions. But we know that individual actions alone are not enough to bring back 3 billion birds. We also need to see broad scale change. And so for those of us who work in bird conservation, this is also a wake-up call. We don't publish a paper like this, 3 billion birds lost, and then go back to our day job. It needs to serve as a catalyst for change. So what are we going to do about this? Business as usual is just not working in bird conservation. So what we need to do now is be much more strategic and focused on where to implement conservation actions with the scarce resources that we have. We've been addressing broad scale threats and habitat needs, But in most cases, we don't really know the specific causes of species declines. So to be more strategic, we need a better idea of what the limiting factors, or what we're calling the smoking guns, actually are. So we're fortunate that there have been incredible advances in ornithology recently that can help us identify these smoking guns, especially technological, methodological advances such as miniaturized tracking devices that can follow birds like this Hudsonian godwit on their 5,000-mile journeys from Arctic Alaska to the south tip of South America and back. And so this kind of research needs to happen on a species by species basis, really, because even species in the same habitat have different biology, might go to different places, and are under different threats throughout their annual cycle. So in the past year, we've focused on a new research approach that really involves first deciding which species to focus on first, because we don't really have the resources to study every bird, and then targeting this research to fill critical knowledge gaps that can help us determine these limiting factors. And then figuring out where and when in the bird's migratory cycle these limiting factors are acting, and then making sure that this new information makes it into conservation plans and to the managers who can implement these actions on the ground. And we've been referring to this whole process as the road to recovery. So to identify these highest priority species, to apply the road to recovery approach, we looked for species that met 3 criteria. They had to be already species that were identified as high concern. So they were on the watch list, for example, that Partners in Flight creates. They had to be species that were showing this steep decline, a 50% loss at least over since 1970, based on the science paper results, and species for which we could, when we project their trends forward, we're expecting them to lose another 50% of their population in the near future. So, birds that have a high degree of urgency associated with them. And the species that are on this list are not really a surprise. There are many of the grassland birds, such as the bobolink. Most shorebird species are in steep decline. Even some of the common birds we see through upstate New York, like lesser yellowlegs, are very steeply declining. Many of the seabirds are of high concern all over the world. Long distance migrant forest birds that go down to South America, such as golden wing warbler, birds out west in arid desert regions, such as sage grouse, and then this group of aerial insectivores, including the chimney swift, that are just seeing steep declines across the board. These are the species most likely to slip into threatened and endangered status, even though they're not endangered species yet, in the near future, and for which it's most urgent that we identify these specific causes of their declines. So then the next step is to assess where each of these species is in terms of the road to recovery. So majority of the species, we have very little information in terms of why they're declining. So for example, evening grosbeaks. Everybody has noticed this decline in evening grosbeaks, but we really don't have much information at all on why that might be happening. There are other species such as whippoorwills where a working group has formed. There's been some targeted monitoring programs, some research, but we still really know very little. And then on to a bird like the golden wing warbler, where there's a whole initiative in terms of research, planning on both breeding and wintering grounds, but we still don't really know exactly where this species is limited. And then birds like salt marsh sparrow, where there's a brand new implementation strategy that's just been released with specific management actions to address what has been determined to be the key limiting factor for the species, which is sea level rise along the coast. And where we're trying to get to are a bird like the Kirtland's warbler, where the limiting factors were identified, they're being addressed, the species is recovering, and this is a bird that was recently taken off the endangered species list. So that's really our goal with this whole process. And once we have the new science, figuring out what's causing the declines, where and when to target conservation actions, that's when the real work of conservation begins. And fortunately, we have a large array of conservation tools to work with, from a whole new generation of conservation plans that are being developed using a business planning approach that has costs and risks associated with them. And these are providing roadmaps for species recovery. A wide range of programs to deliver habitat conservation, including programs within the US Farm Bill that we highlighted in this 2017 State of the Birds report. The Farm Bill is actually the largest source of conservation funds in the US. And these programs can be used to develop lasting solutions in working food producing landscapes that are also critical for sustaining healthy populations of these steeply declining grassland birds. So these birds are not found in national parks or preserves, and we have to do this work on private property and in working landscapes. And then there are these public-private partnerships known as migratory bird joint ventures that span the whole continent now and bring together government agencies, conservation organizations, industry, and other partners, just all to implement conservation at these regional scales. But to re-envision bird conservation, we also need to rethink the policies that we have that protect birds. And we know that now is not the time to be weakening legal protections for migratory birds, but that is exactly what's happening, as was mentioned prior to the presentation. This new interpretation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that right now makes it so that companies are no longer subject to prosecution or fines for killing birds, even after a major disaster like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which in 2010 destroyed or injured about 1 million birds, and for which BP paid $100 million in fines. That would no longer happen under the current rules of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And this is just one of many environmental policies that are being currently rolled back and should make us very angry. But the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is more than 100 years old. So even without these rollbacks, it doesn't really provide adequate protections for migratory birds that are moving across the entire hemisphere. So we need to be thinking about new sets of policies and legislation. One of these that's currently being considered is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And we produced a State of the Birds report last year using the results from the 3 Billion Birds Lost paper as a means for making the case that we need an entirely new funding stream for state agencies. There's lots and lots of resources for waterfowl and other game species, but there's very little funding to conserve non-game wildlife. And this act would provide $1.3 billion per year to the states to focus specifically on non-game wildlife, which is where most of our birds are. And then there's some completely new ideas out there, like having a songbird conservation stamp that can parallel the duck stamp, which has been very highly successful, raised billions of dollars for wetland protection, waterfowl conservation. So we need similar action, similar success in other bird habitats. Ultimately, though, to accomplish this broad scale change, the people who love birds and nature need to become a political force. We're already a huge economic force, spending more than $40 billion a year annually. But we also need to think of this now in the context of current events, right? So we know that during this pandemic, there's been a dramatic increase in outdoor activities, nature activities, and awareness of birds, pollinators, other aspects of nature. And there's been this huge spike in participation in citizen science, such as eBirds, just seeing a tremendous spike in the past year. And there's been an increased awareness of social justice and diversity issues in birding and conservation organizations, just as everywhere else. And events like the Black Birders Week are literally changing the face of bird conservation. So these are tremendous opportunities that have developed in what is otherwise a very challenging and uncertain time. So how do we best embrace these changes and weave them into our response for bringing back 3 billion birds? And so we're hopefully seeing a political transition that's about to occur. And so now is really the time to make sure that we're putting nature and environment back onto the political agenda. So now that this paper, 3 billion birds lost, which has just become kind of a household word now through the conservation community, which is what we were hoping. Now that we've gotten everybody's attention, it's time for all of us to think about what we can do to help bring back these 3 billion birds. I believe this is another moment in time for conservation, perhaps a moment like Silent Spring was. It has the chance to help change our national consciousness and the trajectory needed to save birds and our environment. So thank you very much. I'm hoping you're all still out there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right, so yeah, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask away. Looks like Jay has a question.
Yeah, so is anybody going to moderate or just blurt out your question, I guess?
Yeah, looks like.
Okay, we know that insects are in severe decline as well as birds, and I'm wondering how much of a factor that is in the decline of birds, because almost all birds eat insects at some stage of their lives.
Yeah, well, almost certainly it's a huge factor. It's a lot more difficult to measure insect populations than it is bird populations. There have been a couple of big studies that have come out that have pointed to very large declines in insect populations, especially large flying insects that a lot of these birds depend on. So undoubtedly, this is one of the things that's happening globally, especially with the increased use of pesticides all over the world that's been detected even in the upper atmosphere. But so it's one of these things where we know it's happening, but it's very difficult to measure and very difficult to sort of pin down as a smoking gun, you know, that these birds are declining because of this loss of insects.
Just like to say thank you
Dominique?
very much, Ken. So far, I have trouble unmuting myself for some reason, but excellent talk. And I think we all need to think about this and what we can each do to work towards what you are suggesting, which is, you know, becoming a bigger force, just similar to the game folks who have become a force, and how birders who do it for recreation to look at birds can also become more of a force. It's an important thing that we as a group can work towards, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Looks like Anne also has a question.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation. I've been giving talks lately for libraries on things like Feeder Watch and eBird. And when I talk about the 7 or 8 most important things that people can do, the one that I get the biggest pushback on is cats. And people who are cat lovers do not own the huge tragedy of outdoor cats. And I wonder what we can do. They say that, oh, their house cats don't kill birds. It's only feral cats that kill birds. But we know there are all kinds of cats in the environment, and what can we do as citizens, and how can we get across that message to people who are cat owners? I'll mute myself.
Yeah, well, I don't have the answer, but I mean, that's a huge question, a huge point. And, even if it could be argued that feral cats are doing the most damage, the number of feral cats is increasing exponentially. Studies have shown that. That's because people are letting their cats out, and there are these feral cat colonies that are being maintained, through supplemental feeding. It's just a supplemental feeding of predators, basically. And it's a big problem, and there are groups that are really dedicated to addressing that. And American Bird Conservancy has a whole campaign and a lot of resources on their website. And I know that all the state agencies are struggling with that issue, because it sort of comes down to a policy issue, and every state is different in how they address this. And what's happening, of course, are the cat lover groups are much more savvy than the bird lover groups, and they get into communities and into municipalities, and they get ordinances passed to make these areas cat sanctuaries, and have these legal cat colonies, and there's very little that people can do about it. So it's a big education issue, but also a big policy issue. So I don't have an answer, unfortunately.
As a person who has been a cat owner for more than 40 years, and the last 5, well, all of my cats live indoors. If they're lucky, we've lived in a house that had a porch or something. But the best approach that's worked with me has been one-on-one, individual, with kindness. I have a neighbor who I've talked to numerous times over the years. They're in their mid-80s. They're not necessarily going to change their way, but they were bemoaning the fact that their cats, they never can keep a cat more than 2 years. So I did suggest to them recently that they try with their next kitten, leaving it in the house, and it's working out well for them as well. So sometimes you just have to be persistent and gentle with people. And in the meanwhile, other cats in the neighborhood, they know if they see me that they run, because I just like growl at them if they come in my yard and go near my bird feeders. So you just have to do what you can.
But as big a problem as that is, imagine all these feral cats that are allowed to proliferate even on public lands and state parks and refuges. So you got to pick your battles, but numerically that is where probably more of the damage is happening, and we're not even addressing. That's something we probably could be addressing, the feral cat issue, more than the individual homeowner cats. But you're right.
Christopher has a question. Christopher has a question. Chris, you're muted. We can't hear you.
There we go.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Ken, in regards to agriculture, is there any effort to reestablish hedgerows, for example, or, and then secondly, why do we keep selling Roundup in such huge quantities in the hardware stores? It seems like there's evidence that it's not good for anything, anybody.
Yeah. Well, right. I mean, what has to happen is something like what happened with DDT, public outcry. I mean, that was fought like crazy by the industry and by the chemical companies. And they're winning the battle right now, because, they're claiming that there isn't enough evidence. And other countries around the world are banning these chemicals, but we're not very close to that in the US. And when it comes to hedgerows and some of these other measures to bring back some of the nature in the agricultural land, that's what these farm bill programs are really all about. And a lot of farmers love wildlife and would like to see, wildlife return to their farms. And these are programs that give them incentives to do that, whether it's planting hedgerows or just retaining, the ability to retain fallow fields. In our area, of course, most of the grassland birds are in these pastures that are getting mowed every year. So just, but the farmers can't afford to not mow their fields. So if we want birds and we want fields, then as a society, we have to be able to pay for that and compensate the farmers. And that's what these programs are all about. But they're either underfunded or people don't know about them. And so it's a tremendous opportunity that's there that really needs to be leveraged a lot more for birds.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Dominic.
Liz, can I just, it's more of a comment than a question, but Ken had a really wonderful list of 7 things people can do. And over the last 5 years, we've had articles on a lot of those things that people can do in the Little Gull, and it's part of revising the conservation section of the website. I've been going through and trying to recollect some of those articles so that they can be easy access on the website. So if people do have a yard and want to garden with more native vegetation, they'll be able to find resources on our website, and some of the other issues that were mentioned there as well. So they're little, you might think of them as little things, but they really add up. If everybody can do something, it makes a difference. So
yeah, that's great to hear. And that website that I mentioned, the 3billionbirds.org, that's still up there. And one of the purposes of that site is for groups like your group to, those are all resources that can be shared. The infographics, any of the videos on there, any of the information, you can take and use in these local campaigns. So that's still up there. That's still active and important.
Great. Dominic, I think you had a question.
The current administration, federal administration, has been deregulating things and abridging regulations for the last 4 years, and there's been a lot of legislation that has protected wildlife that's not being subscribed to now. Now we're going to have a change in administration. Is there, among the groups you talked about, is there a piece that works specifically to try to influence the government in terms of some of the important regulations that we've lost in recent times? Is there a coupling between the conservation organizations at high level and some of the government, the new administration that's coming in? Do you know anything like that?
Yeah, I do. That's a great question. And I noticed and love the poster you have in your background, which is the Partners in Flight.
Right. You can see that, huh?
Partnerships poster, which I recognize, and that is actually part of the answer. So there are these partnerships that have formed, that allow the government agencies to participate in these activities in a sort of more friendly way. And we've had those partnerships for a while. And, over the different administrations, these have grown and waned. And everybody's been just sort of ducking under the radar for the last 4 years. But what we're seeing right now, we just had a workshop last week, and one of the assistant directors for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service spoke and gave a very forward-thinking perspective. These guys are just waiting for the opportunity to do great things again within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're using in a very positive way this 3 billion birds lost message as an urgent message to kind of get their house together within the agency. I mean, just as one example, the Fish and Wildlife Service has about 10 different divisions which don't even really talk to each other very much, and you have refuges and you have migratory birds and the whole hunting thing. And they're all kind of uniting now around this 3 billion birds and trying to think of how they can work internally for, you know, a more coordinated response. And then that's the agency that works with all the other government agencies. So that's just one example. We're also, I mean, people are pretty savvy about this, and you have policy groups from the Audubon Society nationally, and American Bird Conservancy have been working on a whole policy agenda, and they're already sort of embedded into the Biden transition team, trying to get this, you know, legislation on the agenda. So, you know, we're somewhat optimistic. People are definitely thinking about that and are working on it right now. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
I see Michael Greener has his hand up.
I have a question. One thing I haven't seen much in the way of theme, and that's the role of invasive plants on bird habitat. It's anecdotal, but in my area, there used to be a lot of farm wetlands that were all cattails and red-winged blackbirds. Now they're all Phragmites.
Yeah. Yeah, well, invasive species, that's sort of like insect declines. It's just, it's everywhere. It's very difficult to control. It's difficult to measure. It's definitely, you know, something that people are aware of, and there are invasive species programs that organizations have and that the agencies have. There are, you know, Phragmites fighting programs. It's just really hard, and in a lot of cases we just lose the battle. So, you know, again, I don't have a good answer other than yes, it's a big problem, and people are working on it, but it's a tough one.
Yeah, it just seems that that would be a fairly easy one to get people behind, because nobody likes invasive plants. Of course, everybody's got lawns; those are invasives too.
Yeah, what was the stat I saw? There are 40 million acres of lawns in the United States. That's more acreage than there is of corn. So talk about, yeah, I mean, in some ways it seems like a simple solution because we could do something about it, but when you're trying to change society, that could be harder than trying to change the government, right? So none of it is easy.
Mary Moore had a question.
May I do a little advertising? I've been working for about 2.5 years in Pittsford to try to stop the use of pesticides by the town. And it's becoming, they're using less and less. We also have a toxin-free challenge in our town of Pittsford for all those people who are from Pittsford. And you can get a sign that says organic lawn. And it is to stop people from using pesticides on their lawns. We're also trying to combine with that for next year, reducing lawns and also planting natives. So that's another, you know, part of it that we're trying to get done. I partnered with Megan Meyer. I think she's on here. She's from Penfield, and Penfield would also like to, she would like to start the no pesticide rule in Penfield. So the two of us, in order to kind of reach out with these programs, we're going to have a four-part series, Encouraging Nature in Your Own Backyard. That will be in February. It's on 4 Thursday evenings, a Zoom presentation. We have Chris Lajewski from Montezuma, who will be talking about birds and the pesticide idea with reducing lawn pesticides so birds can flourish. We have Megan herself will be doing something on perennials and also native plants. We have Janet Allen. She's the Habitat Gardening in Central New York. And she's going to be doing something on insects. But she calls them the little things that run the world. And then we have Margot Fass, who will be doing something on frogs. She has what's called the Frog House in Pittsford. So she'll be talking about, again, the horrible kind of disaster that we have with the effect of pesticides on our wildlife. So if any of you would like to be part of any of those things, that would be really great. I really need the help in Pittsford, and also Megan needs the help in Penfield. So I can give you my email address if you'd like. And if she's on, she can give you hers too. So thank
Yeah,
you.
Mary, how does one sign up for those Zoom broadcasts?
I can send you that information. We're going through the libraries, both Penfield and Pittsford. So they will be giving us that information probably in January. As far as the address, is that correct, Megan?
Yeah, I think the town of Penfield will be signing people on 2 weeks before the programs. I'm not sure about Pittsford, but it will be on their websites, and it's their adult education, through their adult education programs.
Maybe you guys could put together a small blurb to get to Jay Greenberg by the 15th of December so it can get in our January newsletter.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
That'd be wonderful. It looks like Christy has her hand up also.
Nicely, because I have mooched off 2 clubs that I will join eventually. One is this, and one is the Rochester Garden Club, who had Doug Tallamy doing a Zoom presentation on native gardening. And I've just joined the board of the Friends of Washington Grove, and I was really interested in the migratory bird joint venture concept. And I'm wondering, that sounded very large scale, but I'm wondering if there are successful models for small parks that are very conservation oriented, habitat oriented, that have connected with, say, neighborhood groups to say, hey, this is what a healthy habitat looks like in our area, and how can you maybe carry that out into your yard? If anyone knows any models for that.
Just word of mouth. Christy, in my neighborhood, my house was on the garden tour for Genesee Land Trust a couple of years ago, and I'm kind of known as the lady with the weedy front yard, but I happily give away seeds to people in my neighborhood, and especially this year with COVID, we've been out walking a lot in the neighborhood, and we've been sharing seeds between people. We're finding out who likes to garden and who doesn't. So just really person by person in your neighborhood. That's one way to go about doing it. I just recently dropped a bunch of seed off at the birdhouse that it's being given away for free to folks. In a non-COVID year, we've given it away at different community environmental events, but we haven't had that opportunity this year. But just, yeah, word of mouth and education. Again, we're going to expand that section on the RBA conservation part of the page. So, and there's other resources out there. So, but just as far as connecting with your neighborhood, really just talking with your neighbors, gardening in your own space, if you know, if you can, and sharing.
Yeah, it's great to hear about all these local, grassroots efforts. That's really where it needs to start. That was an interesting question, though, about, thinking about it as a joint venture, because that's a relatively new concept, and it is occurring at these pretty large regional scales, but they very often involve, the local TNC groups or the state wildlife biologists. So it might be an interesting idea to try to scale that down and think about, because what it does is it gets people around the table who normally wouldn't sit down and talk to each other, and it's not like they're coming to an Audubon meeting. It's not like it's one organization. The joint venture is like a neutral ground, and everybody can express their views. So it's a very successful model. It'll be interesting to try that at a local level, I think.
It looks like Angie also has her hand raised.
Yes, Ken, I was actually just wondering about I know that the bald eagle is one of the biggest examples of conservation at work and working, and those numbers coming back up. And I was just curious about some other species that you could show as an example, or like as I'm talking to people and I'm talking about conservation, the bald eagle is kind of an obvious one,
Right.
but I'm also wondering about some other species.
Well, there are a bunch of birds, in that bald eagle category, osprey, peregrine falcon. A lot of the raptors are really responding positively to that same, suite of actions. And then there's the whole waterfowl wetland. Beyond that, I mean, there are individual, well, bluebird is another great example, the eastern bluebird, and that really, New York State led the way with that recovery effort that started in the 60s and 70s, just these bluebird trails and people putting up houses and bluebirds are one of the species we see as an increasing species right now, but it was in steep decline in the 60s and 70s according to the data. So and then there are some birds that we're trying very hard on, and there might be some local success stories for some of the grassland birds. Trying to think of some others that might be good examples in New York. Then there are birds that have recently gone off of the endangered species list. I mentioned the Kirtland's warbler. Over in Michigan is one of the. It's not out of the woods yet, but their populations have been increasing so much that they were taken off. They were delisted. And there are a few other. I mean, there's talk about potentially taking the red-cockaded woodpecker off the list because there's been so much management and so much positive response. So I don't know if those are huge success stories, but yeah, there's a few examples. There are some birds that are doing well and we don't know why they're doing well. So we could claim them, the red-eyed vireo conservation success, but we don't know why they're doing well.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Trying to get all the screens. Well, Ken, I think we've answered many questions, and I just wanted to thank you again so much for presenting tonight. I think we've all learned a lot about the current state of birds, and it was great. So thank you again for joining us tonight. Give everybody a clap, a silent clap.
Thank you, everybody, and nice to meet you, and hope to see you out birding when we're all able to do it.
Yes, I look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay,
If you want to hang on for just a bit, Ken, and while we, Liz, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will have another presentation in January. So that's next month as part of our annual meeting. And Jeannie has lined up with another really great speaker. And her name
is Erica Erickson, Laura Erickson.
Laura Erickson. She is an author of many different books, including the Birdwatcher's Answer book, I believe it's called, which is it's a great small little pocket book. And she has a new book called The Love Lives of Birds, which is a beautiful book, which she will be presenting on. So I hope to see you guys all there. It should be a lot of fun. And that is on a Saturday, which our annual meeting is usually on. So we're keeping up with that tradition, and it is on January 16th. So you'll get an email about that as well. And thank you guys again for tuning in tonight.
I'm glad I didn't have to follow Laura Erickson. So that's going to be a great talk.
Great. Yes. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and enjoy your birds and birding.
Night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Yeah, we had over 70 people. It was 72-ish.
Yeah.
74, I think.
Yeah, could have been
Yeah, it's 77 at the height.
77. Great. That's great. I think that might be a new record.
Wow, great.
There you go, Ken. Yeah, I figure you knew Laura. You probably knew her at one point.
Yeah, well, she was actually at the Cornell lab for a while.
Yeah, right, right. It's nice to see everybody.
Yeah, very good turnout. Very nice.
Rick Wilder, I didn't get to say hello to him.
Yeah, well, sorry for the noise there in the middle. My wife was making something with a grater, and it was, I could barely hear myself talking.
I couldn't hear it on my screen for some
Oh,
reason.
okay.
So,
It was just a little. You could hear a little bit.
Right, yeah, I was afraid, and I didn't want to mute myself because I'd never get back. So,
uh,
all right, well,
All right.
there,
Well.
there is some dinner for me waiting.
Thank you so much for the,
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
It was very nice.
Thank you.
We're in Sierra Vista, Arizona right now, and last year there were quite a few, fewer birds, which is a shame. Bless you. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I was there with you.
Yeah, really. Sierra Vista would be cool.
All right, have a good
Nice
night.
to see you, Richard. Okay,
Yep.
thank you, Ken, again.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your dinner. Okay. This
Thanks,
was wow. Yeah, this was good. All right, and I will
Bye.
get this downloaded and we'll get it up on YouTube. So I'll be in
Great.
touch about that.
All right.
Take
Perfect.
care. Have a good night.
Thanks. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.